Hello, everyone. I will profit from these 2 minutes to ask you. I know already that I have a couple of 30 minutes to my intervention, right? And should I make the screen possible to see, because I brought the PPT also, or we can only talk about it? I don't know which dynamic is most preferable.
Yes, you maybe test your PowerPoint presentation if you want.
Okay.
Right now.
So
just
I'm going
to check.
Try. Okay. So let me see if I can share the screen. And sharing. Is it on?
Not yet.
Okay.
No, not yet. Do you have permission from the host?
I hope so. Let me see.
Rukiye is the...
I think we all have permission to share screen.
Ah, okay. Now
Try
you are
it now,
going.
Sonia.
I'm going to try because it says that they have an error or something here.
Yeah, in my screen opens and vanishes.
I'm going to close and I'll try again. Let me see. Share the screen. Okay. I'm going to try one more time. Maybe. If I try to share the screen, it doesn't go.
Share screen and then
yes. Now
done.
It's working, I guess, right?
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Perfect.
And Monica, so maybe we should start right now.
Okay. Okay, I will gladly do so. Welcome you all to the keynote speaker session today at IEPAS 2021. Yes, of course. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to participate in this session, in particular for being the chair, the moderator of this keynote speaker. I will introduce briefly our speaker today. She's Dr. Sónia Sénica. She holds a PhD in international relations from Nova University. She's an integrated researcher at IPRI, Portuguese Institute for International Relations. She has been working on the issues with Russia and Russia's foreign policy. Her last publication, forthcoming in this year, is entitled "The Bear Has Taken the Honey, Putin's Russia Predictability." It will be published in a coordinated book called Trends and Transformation in World Politics by Lexington Books. So we look forward to have access to that article of yours, to that chapter of yours, Sonia. I'm very happy to do this. Thank you for having accepted to be a keynote speaker here today. Dr. Sónia Sénica will be talking on Russia and the new bipolarity, the new Gambit in international order. I would just like to ask the participants, when we get to the Q&A part, please raise your hands or write the questions on the chat, as then they will be forwarded to me, and I will put that questions to Dr. Sénica. Again, thank you so much, Sonia, for being here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Ana Mónica Fonseca. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here today, especially profiting for this position as a keynote speaker. So it's a great honor to me to attend this international scientific event, which is very known already among the people who study Eurasia and Russia, which is my case. So I'm very glad, and I hope that you all feel free to join me in this reflection throughout this hour. And of course, I would like to address a special thank you to the organization committee and Professor Luis Tomé Professor Ragman Dag, or Professor Ozuk Tufekci, Professor Ana-Isabel Xavier, Professor Cristina Diaz, and Professor Murak Semrek, of course, and also Professor Luís Nuno Rodrigues. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure. So with no further long ado, I'm going to start my communication. As I said at the previous part, it's like a reflection that I want to bring us today, and so feel free to comment or make any questions, sorry, at any time about the subject. So the three key ideas for our reflection today, it starts firstly on what is now known as the decline of international liberal order led by the United States of America, especially since the implosion of USSR and of course the end of the Cold War, and the emergence of other actors, especially namely China. The second idea I'm going to bring today is, of course, this Russian path towards an even more assertive and militarized foreign policy, and of course, domestically and more authoritarian regime, which means that from the the famous intermestic from the Russian federations, we have a constitutive policy and style and type of governance, which means that Russia wants to assess and project its image as a power, a great power on the international arena, having these two dimensions altogether, the famous external and domestically dimensions of both of Putin's governance of Russia. And finally, to assess in what way Russia is going to have a place in the international system, meaning that with all these 21 years that is already been celebrated, that President Vladimir Putin has led the country since 2000, which is the path that Russia wants to go and wants to take in international system. I know that this next presentation, it's a bit small, but it will help with some guidelines to my proposition of understanding in which way we came to this path towards a new bipolarity, or if you want, some analysts justify it like a post-pandemic or post-COVID world. So regarding the West and non-Western powers, I just came here with 4 of them that I think they might just help us to think about this. So of course, one of the poles being the USA, the United States, I had to bring some main events, some food for thought about these results that made the at present moment outcomes. So we have, of course, the turning point of the military intervention in Iraq after the 9/11, and all the subsequent decisions and positions that were made by especially the George W. Bush administration, and which was in my opinion, of course, the beginning of a path towards a decline of unipolarity and the beginning of some actions that led to some international criticism and skepticism towards the US foreign policy, which led us to the bipolarity today. So, of course, we have some other important and main events, which ones I gave some examples. We have also the retraction from the Middle East during the Obama's administrations. Everybody recalls, of course, the red lines imposed in the Syria matter, and which was the outcome of some kind of lack of credibility for the administration at that point. Then we have, of course, during the Trump administration, the beginning of the clarity of the evidence, for me at least, that 2 poles were going to be addressed. And so we had, of course, the US and China trade war. We had also a couple of other positions and decisions made by the United States in terms of its foreign policy that was also and had also a great impact, not only in the traditional alliances, especially with Western and European countries, but of course in all the dynamics around the world, especially in the Middle East, of course. So we have, and I pointed out, of course, there's some quarrels between the NATO allies in terms of budget context. We have, of course, importance and recently made military retreats from Afghanistan, which had, as all we know, a huge impact not only in the US credibility abroad, but especially noted that the focus of the foreign policy in the Biden administration is clearly changing its way and focusing on another area and vector, as you know, the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, we had a landmark in terms of the US and Russia relation, which was the first Biden-Putin summit in Geneva, where, from my point of view, the Russian president got his way, which was like to have the external recognition from his peers that Russia was, in fact, a great power, which was something that was named by the president, the American president, Biden. So clearly he got his way, and some of the key subjects that were like creating a great tension between Russia and the West, of course, United States, such as the Navalny case, the meddling, alleged meddling in some elections, Western elections and so on, cyber attacks. All of that was like secondarized, I guess, by the major outcome that the Russian diplomacy got its way. Of course, this is my point of view. So finally, I stretch, of course, the recently made strategic deepening with the Anglophile vector, which means the famous and now very published the AUKUS, with, of course, the UK and Australia, and all the dynamics that is going to change, especially and once again in the Pacific region, and of course in the Pacific region. And finally, the admitting that from the US point of view, there is a clear perception that China is the only competitor, especially in economic sense. But of course, Russia is the biggest threat. So clearly this path where the Biden administration assumes at this point that there are in fact, and which were the opponents in this bipolarity, leads clearly to a different kind of outcomes, especially in terms of foreign policy. So I guess I named here a couple of them, especially, and I think, and foremost for me, the skepticism of some kind of European allies, especially with this recent partnership with UK and of course Australia, in regards of what kind of step or kind of strategic ally is this that wants to have repercussions in NATO alliances and of course with the European partners. I guess for a long time the Europeans were expecting, especially since the Trump administration, that the US would start to revitalize once more the partnership with Europe and its traditional partners, the transatlantic line. But I don't know in which way this might suggest or suppose that we are going to have here a clearly assumption that the focus, US focus, is of course the containment of China, and so the area important is around that zone. Of course, I had to bring here some important events regarding China, the China Belt and Road Initiative, the questions regarding democracy in Hong Kong, of course, the question of Taiwan, the insurers in Xinjiang, and of course, the South of China, the sea militarized, and the sea power presence that China wants to have with the famous islands. All in all, turns to the fact that the President Xi Jinping has said recently that Beijing wants to be treated as an equal. So once again, of course, by the United States. So once again, we have here a kind of assumption from the part of other poles that finally they want to assume that role. Of course, that gave rise to all kinds of fears from the Western side due to this China's emergency. Of course, the instability engine of the Indo-Pacific region is appointed to be, of course, China. China is facing all this kind of criticism from the international community, and the major oppositor or competitor is clearly, from the China point of view, especially in the economic area, of course, the United States. Again, Russia, for me, like in the chess board, needs to see if she wants to be one of the players or one of the chess pawn. So that's why I use the term Gambit. I don't know if you all sharing me the pleasure of playing chess, but I think it was kind of funny to bring this analogy. So from the Russia point of view, of course, we had some main events which were turning points that led to this path to bipolarity, but especially to this kind of assumption that Russia wanted to be recognized in international community, especially by the United States, as one great power, of course, but having always the interests and specificities being aware. So externally and of course domestically. So we had, of course, big landmarks, big events for me, such as the military intervention in Georgia in 2008, of course, the annexation of Crimea 2014, the military intervention in Syria conflict in 2015. Those are three major, for me, interventions that mark a big change in Russian foreign policy, and in a way that he perceived that he had to find his place in the world and have his own red lines. Of course, the military intervention in Syria goes along further to what they call filling the gap in the Middle East, when, especially during the Obama's administration, the USA gave a rose to this kind of retraction from the Middle East and a change of focus in foreign policy. Other important events that I named here or cases are, of course, the Skripal case, the Navalny case, which gave a rose to a projection of international level of some matters that Russia wanted to attend at a domestic level, and one of Russia's red lines, of course. Another important for me, is especially in dealing with one of the poles, the United States, was, of course, the alleged meddling in the events like electoral procedures, especially during the election of President Trump. Of course, I think that since then, the Russiagate, if you want, clearly came back to the national politics in the administration in USA, which is very important from the political and diplomatic point of view, of course. There's, of course, other important aspects, the question of the cyber attacks, which are very regarded from the administration United States point of view, like almost a terrorist, national security terrorist attack. So we have to measure here the importance that this player like Russia wants to address the international players and how it wants to project this image, and especially how it wants to be perceived by the two poles. Once again, the United States and China. Of course, all in all, this all gave a rose to even more distancement between the Russia Federation and especially the West, USA, and of course, European Union, which gave to this what is called now a cold treatment to the Western Pole, and especially during some meetings with, in particular, some representatives of the European Union project. So that being said, we have some particular outcomes at present moment. Again, Russia more assertive and militarized foreign policy. I can only remember in the recent moment that we had not long ago the presence of military force, ground force in the border with Ukraine, which immediately was a manifestation of strength and power, and very close to happening the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva. So from a perspective like political and diplomatic, not only military, that was a great demonstration of power. Of course, we have, international sanctions during to all these kinds of events. Again, Russia being declared by the United States as the biggest threat. Finally, I thought that would be a justice to bring another actor, the European Union, because sometimes the European Union, of course, has ties with all these other actors. And of course, it seems like here being a kind of different encompassing and balancing between all this kind of dynamics, especially now with this new perplexity towards especially strategic parties like IEPAS, as I said previously. So I guess the EU project has shown us in the last couple of years a great, especially a fragility of the project with all those crises that was happening. Of course, the financial crisis, the migrant crisis, and the difficulty to have a solution, political one, and of course the question of Turkey, Ukraine crisis, the Brexit itself, which gave, from my point of view, it really shook the project, European project, in a very impactful way, and the Nord Stream 2 project towards the relations that Germany, an important country in EU membership, EU member has with Russia, and of course, as always, the pandemic crisis and the wave of populism in some civil societies and some governments in the European Union. All this shown, again, a great fragile EU project on the one side, and on the other side, always great dependence of the German and French gear to hold on the projects. Of course, in terms of the external projection of the European Union role, it seems that lacks and still lacks an international power recognition, especially now from the hard power point of view. I guess that since the IEPAS was announced, it gave the opportunity to have some reflection towards the European defense military project that has been talked in for a long time. And, you know, those of you who go along the European Union subjects know what I mean. So, and that, of course, in the end shows a great dependency of the NATO security apparatus for the Europe as the European Union members. So all in all, this brings us to this kind of, as I told you, trend towards a new bipolarity, which is from the one side, United States and Russia from, and China from the other side, and of course Russia here seeking to see which way, which side, and needs to be the most practical and benefit for her, for itself. So the main characteristics that I brought to you regarding this new bipolarity are, of course, the emergency of these two powers, especially in economically way, but also, and now we can see that clearly in the diplomatic and political way, and of course the military way. So this differs and sets the stage for a lot of debate. We had on the previous conference last year talk about it. Is it the new Cold War? Is it Cold War 2.0 and so on? But clearly it seems that we have, of course, a new dynamic, and of course different actors in this bipolarity, and there are some characteristics that doesn't fit in the previous model of the Cold War. So I'm going to pass that because we have already talked about it last year. So I'm going to pose the question in some of the major points that I think is important, like the antagonism felt in this bipolarity between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes. And in a way, they feel they can align from different poles. That, of course, goes along with different types of governance, different types of economic ways and plans, and of course, the difference in terms of values. This is like a huge debate that is going to, I think, occupy most of our times in the next years, because it really feels that, in my point of view, of course, that world is torn really in two parts. Especially during the COVID pandemic, I thought it made very clear that even though there's a trend to this bipolarity, at the end, the sides seem to be very much apart with different kind of project proposals in international matters. So regarding the West, I think we need to address and repeat that, in fact, at this point of view, the West isn't aligned, especially since the Trump administration. There was a lack of confidence between the USA and, of course, the transatlantic alliances, especially the European allies in the European Union. So that was clearly a point out, namely in France regard, especially the President Macron has been having a lot of thought and a lot of intervention, public intervention, say that Europe needs to go forward and separate itself even further from the NATO need always to address security architecture in this region. So I think that the outposts at this point really set the floor for the next stage that needs to be addressed by the European Union project. Other characteristic that I think that needs to be here talked about is that, especially since the Obama administration, and I can remember an article made by the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Foreign Affairs magazine, that was the Asian century, which means that clearly the path towards a perception that the emergency of China was evident at that point, needed that the foreign policy of the United States was obviously need to change towards a new dynamic, a new readjustment, a new reevaluation of even interests, of course, and of course the focus on the Indo-Pacific region once again. Finally, one thing that I think is also important to refer, especially from the Russia point of view, is the famous alternative proposals that are presented sometimes. The new dynamic of alliance and partnerships. And I name here the Astana process for those who follow the Syria conflict. There was a new dynamic, if you want, and a new way of addressing the crisis. And Russia called for, of course, Iran and Turkey to try to find a way with all the parties involved in the conflict to get the solution for peace. Clearly opposing an alternative of the Geneva process that was being led by the United Nations. And of course, I give here the something that is really recent, which is the after the retreat, the military retreat from Afghanistan, from the US point of view, that there was clearly a need for the Russia side to present an alternative, an initiative, set the stage of the conversations to try to find a way to stabilize the country and, of course, the region. And I guess that especially for Russia and China, there's a lot of important issues to be addressed, and the need for Afghanistan to stabilize is really bigger than, and I guess that was the case of Russia and China, or not only choose to not leaving. Of course, they didn't recognize the Taliban government, but they stayed. They had the assumption that they had to stay and set to talk, the dialogue, the diplomatic dialogue. So I talked about previously of the question of COVID-19, and from my point of view and some other analysts that I have read, there is clearly a deeper bifurcation of this global order, if you want, with the pandemic, which was helped for it. So I remember the amendment made by the government, the national government, during the beginning of the sanitary crisis, which gave us the assumption that there was a lack of response and planning towards a problem like this. And I guess the main outcome was, or the main assumption was, the return to the national state. So at the first level, the intervention was the national response being asked for the civil society. And then after the consultation in the multilateral level, I remember the case of European Union, they got along and finally had a plan to get access to the vaccines and a plan to distribute with all the European countries. So this kind of trend, if you want, goes even further to something that has been talked about in recent years, which was the backlash even in some democracies and some civil society asking in which way the public policies are justified in quotation with some liberties and some rights in the democratic regimes. So due to the sanitary crisis, of course. So this is a team that is closer to political science, but anyways, I think that it's necessary to bring here because it not only brings the focus of something like the pandemic crisis to give us a note in which way there was a deepener in this destabilization of organizations and a crisis management of the part of some countries at national and of course international level, but of course it paves the way to an interesting debate that we can have, of course, later or further if you want. Other great tests to most of the countries during the pandemic, and here I remember one thing that I read from Fukuyama's article in The Atlantic last year was that the biggest test was not, of course, the type of regime, because the crisis, the pandemic was transnational, it didn't choose. So the problem was how to gain the trust of the societies, the civil society, regarding the response implemented by their own governments. So I thought that this was very interesting because, of course, it's sometimes hard to justify some kind of adjustment in foreign policy decisions to the internal public domestically if we cannot have this kind of all dynamics in mind of the decision makers, of course. Again, the existing differences was, I guess, exacerbating dealing with this pandemic, also in the battle of international vaccines, or as I prefer, in the vaccine diplomacy. As you all remember, we had a great debate and discussion. It was public and a really great content regarding especially the Sputnik V vaccine, of course, in terms of some countries in the European Union and some other countries abroad. There was a lot of mistrust, of course, towards especially the non-Western vaccines, and it's still going on. So it's kind of hard to see the differences between some poles and some bifurcation in the global stage being brought also to the sanitary crisis management as well. Balancing, of course, was needed from the part especially of what we can call other countries or other actors between this US and Russia in the case of course, vaccine COVID-19. Finally, the pandemic seemed to have helped in some way the United States to also counterbalance China's rise, especially once again in the Indo-Pacific region. And here I give the example, and I bring to all of you the example of course, the Quad has some specific in terms of specificity, in terms of security, arrangement, and prospect. But one of the things that was cautioned was the committed to boost the COVID-19 supply between the members. So this is a great utilization of some other features of the organizations in the international arena and bring to the solution of transnational threats such as the COVID. So going along with my reflection, I'm going to pass and stress here a couple of, I think, important remarks regarding Russia foreign policy, especially since President Putin came to power in 2000. Of course, we had the Medvedev presidency, but well, there is a path towards, at the present moment, of tension with the East, with the West. So most remarks we can have is that, all in all, in the terms of norms and values, the several versions of the Russian concept of the Russian Federation foreign concept gives us a way to see the assumption clearly of this path towards advocating a multipolar world, which is, from the Russian perspective, a way of asking to have its own regional, if you want, influence and power, and to be addressed as one of the powers also, but of course not one of the poles. Russia, again, has always advocated also a line of multilateralism, especially in the case of the UN, which is very, from my point of view, interesting, because it goes, of course, to the fact that the Russian Federation is the heir of the veto and of course plays at UN Security Council of the previous USSR, and of course it needs to have some kind, and wants to have some kind of parts to give, if I might, in all the decisions, important decisions taken to the UN. So of course the need to appeal always to this kind of multilateralism in this kind of particular way, I think it's justified for the Russia's perspective point of view. Finally, especially from the Crimea turning point, we saw clearly some red lines being put out from the President Putin's Russia, which was clearly, on the one hand, the stability of some of the regime, and I think that we can remind of the question of Belarus. Again, the opposition to the enlargement of Western influence in the post-Soviet space, which is for Russia still clearly a red line, an area where it still has and needs to have its interest taken care of. And of course, and finally, one important feature for me, which is always non-interference in internal affairs. That's why the Navalny case was, even though the international projection, always taking care from the Kremlin and Moscow, if you want, from a subject that needs to be attended to and addressed to in a domestic way. So, other thing I think it's important to remark from the Russian perspective is, of course, the cycles and some of the decisions. For me, since 2000 until today, we can clearly mark different cycles. Of course, since all the mandates, we can point out different cycles, but the main one, I think, is the path since the Western cycle in the beginning of President Putin's first mandate until the actual present one, when we clearly have a more Asian one, again, starting to choose one of the both sides. Other thing that for me is important to note is, of course, and again, the turning point that Crimea factor brought, not only to the international Russian policy that if in some way started to use, of course, the need to defend Ruski Mir abroad, the need to defend his interests abroad, of course, and change the frontiers that we had since the Cold War in Europe, but also and especially the image that was projected with this annexation in terms of international politics. And of course, we still have, as you all know, a crisis in the eastern Ukraine, and the difference between, of course, Ukraine and Russia, and the solution towards especially appeasement or even stopping of the conflict and peace, I think is still needs to be addressed in different ways and is still very far from us. And finally, all of this resumes to a kind of more militarized and assertive path in international affairs regarding Russian foreign policy, with all these events that I brought here in some of the outcomes. So I propose to you to look now at the red lines, the strategic lines of the Russian foreign policy in terms of vectors, if you may. And I gave here 3 examples of what is, to me, the Russians' approach plan B in this existent bipolarity. So, for example, in the Central Asia vector, it always tries to give a proposal in alternative to a conflict or crisis management. So again, I remember the question of Afghanistan. Minister Lavrov has already taken some démarche in that sense to try to see, with all the possible countries involved and interested, how to find a way to help not only address the present situation with the actual government, but also find a way to find stability to the country. The African vector, which is one I was gladly to study during my PhD thesis, it's one that it's very interesting, because in the African vector we have a way of cooperation from the Russia side, try to engage with the traditional and African countries, especially using and benefiting from some culture, some political and historical ties, especially in the case of some African countries that speak Portuguese, like in the case of Angola. So the other thing that is pointed out sometimes, that the economic and military technique approach from the Russia footprint in the African continent is also attached, of course, to the fact that there is no criteria to be addressed in terms of respecting some important features from other countries' perspective, like democracy values or respect from human rights. And finally, another example I bring here today is, of course, the Middle East vector. Clearly, it was made a point with the Syrian military intervention in 2015, and of course, the American gap was really noted. But the interest, of course, of the Russia in the region goes further along, and I remember here the meetings that were made also between Russia and Israel to try to set here a new bilateral agenda, which is very interesting. So I don't know how much time do I have, but I think
actually,
I'm on time.
You spent a little bit more, so but go ahead, conclude. I don't know if you.
Thank you. So I'm going
so that we have some time for Q&A.
Okay, so I'm going to go straight along to the final remarks and then leave the rest to the debate. So the final remarks is that, of course, the global system, from my point of view, and some of the analysts that I have been following, has in fact entered in this new transitional period with formation of these 2 new poles, new centers of power. On one side, the United States, and on the other side, China. Sorry. Of course, the emergence of some of the regional power centers, and of course, being Russia one of them, creates sometimes the illusion of multipolarity, because it's advocated by them and it's of course wanted by reasons that I have previously mentioned. Anyway, the polarity is that there are 2 poles, and so the other actors need to choose sides. They are constrained to choose sides in some way. Even with the pandemic and the COVID-19 diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, that was really noted, the choosing of sides. So this bipolarity is also used by the poles at multilateral level. And here I brought the example once again of United Nations because it's very interesting where sometimes Russia and China, or if you want China with Russia aligning on, get along and exert their diplomatic powers and deepen them in some kind of subjects and matters that are taken care of in the UN. So finally, and going to my the beginning of this communication goes in along with why Russia wants to be recognized as a great power and in which way it can accomplish that. So from my point of view, at the present moment, of course, that we are talking, Russia doesn't want to be treated as a different, wants to be treated as an equal. But of course, it doesn't have the capacity still to be one of the greater poles. So from having on one side the United States, on the other side China, I think that it doesn't want to sacrifice via a pawn sacrifice, as I mentioned, a Gambit, but it wants to be like a junior partner towards a bigger project aiming to be an equal one. So I thank you so much for listening to me and for being there all this time. And now feel free to go just to the Q&A part if you want. I'm open to all the questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Sonia, for this wonderful, interesting and very thorough presentation on Russia's actual position on its foreign policy and this particular moment in the international situation. I think it was an amazing tour that you gave us on this topic. So with no further ado, we still have 8 minutes more or less to some Q&A. I would like to ask you to please raise your hands. Sonia, I don't mind, if you don't mind, could you please stop sharing the screen so it's easier to see each other in our screens? Unfortunately, we are still dealing with this Zoom reality.
Okay.
But okay, so we have Andrew Lung.
Well, first of all, thank you, Sonia, for a very comprehensive overview of Russia's strategic position. Of course, that the way the Americans are behaving towards Russia and also China have driven both countries much closer together. But then the two countries are not exactly in a block, forming a kind of a solid block, because the idea of blocks don't work anymore in the multipolar world. But I'm going to pose a very provocative question, and a hypothetical question perhaps, but it's not entirely unlikely, and which of course are going to test your kind of reading of what position Russia would take. Now, you refer to Russia's non-interference with internal affairs and also respecting for country sovereignty. And of course, Taiwan is very much part of China, according to Beijing. It's always been part of China. And if Taiwan declares formal independence, China has made quite clear, and in fact, already prepared and enacted an Anti-Succession Act a number of years ago, with missiles put in positions towards Taiwan. So if push comes to shove, if Taiwan declares independence and China acts militarily to invade Taiwan, and if the United States, move its military power to confront China, what position Russia will take, you think? It's a provocative question. It's not, but it's not entirely 100% unlikely.
Can I answer? Yes.
Yes. I mean, we also have another question that came to me through chat from Professor Ana Isabel Xavier. I will read the question directly. Thank you so much, Sonia, for the brilliant contribution as always. Any particular expected change in the next few days regarding the UK-US alliance in the perspective of Russia, of course? So EU, UK, US alliance, yeah. So I don't know if there's any other question that we can add to this. Okay, so Sonia, go ahead, and then if something else shows up, if you have time, we'll address it.
So thank you so much, Professor Long, for the provocative, I assume, question. And I'm going to start by saying that it's almost a $1 million question at this point. So, of course, that from the no scenarios being made, from my point of view, and for all the narrative, official one, of course, that I've been reading, it seems that, and I hope that it doesn't come to that point when we have the clear confrontation between the two poles, if you want, and the other country needs to, or actor needs to choose sides. And of course, Taiwan is a kind of a sensitive affair for China. But from my point of view, first, I don't think we're going to achieve to that point. There's nobody interested at this point, and the colleagues who follow the China and Taiwan questions are more suited to answer this to you. But from the Russia point of view, I think that Russia would stand by China. Because Russia has always advocating, and for a long time, stability, and of course, an even further line of foreign policy that I think that can understand us to see the Russian side, which is this defense of the Russian mirror. So, like in a parallel with the Taiwan question, if you can address the Ukraine question from the Russian perspective, since, as you know, after the incursion of the USSR, we had a lot of Russophobes being separating from Russia itself and had stayed abroad in the creation of new countries. So in that point of view, if you look for Russia, there's a kind of legitimacy in defending the people abroad, the Russophobes, the language, the culture, the Islamic culture. And it goes further in the case of Russia with the question of cultural identity. So in that sense, and since for China, the Taiwan question has some kind of, similarities, Russia may just find a way to address the conflict and choose the China side. Because it is in his perspective, and in my opinion, the Russia way was going to see that is clearly justified. Of course, and I'm going to defend myself saying that I hope that it doesn't go to that point. We don't need that at this point in international world. Another great conflict, especially between poles. And I hope I have tried to answer the professor's question, but it's of course, and I make the assumption here that it's my opinion, of course. Thank you so much for Professor Isabel Xavier. Well, I think the question was about this new strategic US, Australia, if I may, was it Anna Monica, the question?
I think it was on the other way. I think it was on the other way around. It's written, so it's EU, UK, US. So I think it's EU, UK, and US. So any particular expected change in the next few days regarding the EU, UK, US alliance? That's how I read it. I'm sure. I'm sorry if it's not correct, and if you may correct.
Because it doesn't show here in my.
Yeah, it's only through the sent to the moderator. I'm sorry.
So from the Russian.
Oh no, that's right. You are right. Sorry, Sonia. You are right. It was a written mistake. It is AUKUS. So yes, Australia and US.
Australia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it was
that's
EU.
what I thought.
That's why.
Yeah,
I thought it was a new way of saying things. That's. I probably didn't know.
Thank you so much for helping me anyway. So this is another provocative question, and I think once again, of course, that looking at the assertiveness in foreign policy from the Russian side and the needs to have the international recognition from the peers, this is a thing that is actually profitable. Meaning that this strategic partnership now is going and is doing that, is destabilizing some old alliances, especially in the West and with some countries in Europe regarding the United States, and then, of course, from the part of France. So I guess from the Russian perspective, the Russian side is very much appreciating that this new dynamic is going to be made, and it shows clearly that one of the key arguments and accusations, if you want, that Russia was suffering was that it was very pragmatic and, of course, assertive in terms of defending its interests. Now can tell the same to the United States of America, because in some way the AUKUS, and of course we are all starting to address the subject, but from my perspective, AUKUS shows that clearly there was a big change, a realignment of what was the US national interests in terms of security and abroad, and where was the focus. It's clear. And so the partnership alliances and all that comes after, and decisions and positions in terms of foreign policy are of course aligned with that. So that's very clear. And once again, that in terms of the near abroad for the Russian side, which is of course post-Soviet space and even further Europe, now the alliance and the alignment with the West is not so aligned, if I may. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sonia. I don't know, do we still have time, a little bit extra time? I'm not sure how tight the schedule is. Raman, Luis, is there any other questions that want to come in right now? Well, it appears that we don't have any more questions. So, Sonia, I just wish to thank you so much for this presentation, for this talk. It was really interesting. Yeah, thank you so much.
It was a pleasure for me. Thank you once again.
Thank you. It was very good also to have a good set of participants here as well. So I want just to again thank you all. Thank you to the organization, and wish you all good work and good conference, a continuation of a wonderful conference to you all. And see you on Friday. I will see you again on Friday on the closing session. Okay, so bye-bye. Thank you all. Thank you again, Sonia.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Thank you.